Welcome everyone to today's presentation. My name is Dr. Silkman and the title of my presentation is Game of Bones, Deception of the Pelvic Bone Fragments. And I've decided to break this presentation into two parts. So let's commence with part one. In this presentation, I like to examine the following questions. Firstly, why did the state minimize the significance of the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit bone fragments in the Steve Avery trial, which was held in 2007, yet later released them to the Hallbuck family in 2011? Where were the human and suspect human pelvic bone fragments found? And finally, did the state use deception when it came to the bone fragments? And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to essentially stick to the pelvic bone fragments. Now, it's interesting that during the Stephen Avery trial, Special Prosecutor Ken Kratz stated the following: "Luckily for us and luckily for you, Leslie Eisenberg is your jigsaw puzzle covered box." And Leslie Eisenberg was the state forensic anthropologist. Attorney Kathleen Zellner, who is now representing Stephen Avery, stated, "The most reassuring thing is that we are going to get to the bottom of who killed Teresa Hallbuck, and we firmly believe that we will establish it was not Stephen Avery." So I want to look specifically at the pelvic bones, the significance of the pelvic bones. Now, Dr. Leslie Eisenberg, as I've stated, was the state's forensic anthropologist, and she had stated, Unfortunately, I know little or nothing about how the recovery was undertaken." And Dr. Eisenberg was referring to the discovery and recovery of the human cremains found in this particular case. However, she was questioned about this by Attorney Strang during the Stephen Avery trial. I quote, "Question: that you have no evidence that you saw bone fragments from more than one person. Is that a better way to put it?" Answer: I have no evidence for having seen any duplicate bones in what I examine. That's correct. Question: no evidence that you saw bones that were characteristically male, for example? Answer: no trace that would suggest to me any of those fragments came from a male skeleton. Question: nothing to suggest female human bones of a detectably different age range than the under 30 to 35 years you've testified to here today? Answer: that's correct. Question: the evidence that you have is that the bone fragments here were attributable to one person and one person only? Answer: that's correct. So all of the cremains that were turned over came from, according to Dr. Eisenberg, one individual, one skeletal remain. And of course, human cremains were found at 3 different locations: Stephen Avery's burn pit, Janda Burn Barrel number 2, and the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to limit to discussion of the cremains found at Stephen Avery's burn pit and at the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. Now, we must always remember, we're talking about the potential cremains of Teresa Hallbuck, who was 25 years old at the time. Okay, let's discuss about the adult human female ilium bone fragment. Now, this is a photograph of Stephen Avery's burn pit. Unfortunately, there are no in situ bone photographs. Remember that the state's coroner was prevented from coming onto the Steve Avery site, so we don't have any documentation of the location of where the cremains were found in the burn pit. But allegedly, bones were collected from the Stephen Avery burn pit and they were placed inside a box. And what is quite obvious is that the bone fragments that were collected were heavily fragmented and burnt. This box of bones was given evidence tag 8318. Now, on November the 8th, 2005, Dr. Ken Bennett, who was a forensic anthropologist, he actually was the first person or first anthropologist to examine the cremains. Dr. Bennett had examined the ilium bone. The ilium bone is the uppermost bone of the pelvis, and he found this ilium bone from evidence tag 8318. He had concluded after examining the ilium bone that it was from an adult human female. So in regards to this particular bone fragment, which would have been a few inches in size, was known as a diagnostic bone. He was able to examine this bone fragment, burnt bone fragment, and concluded that it had come from an adult human female. What is interesting is that Dr. Eisenberg did not use the ilium bone to determine the age, the species, or gender of the cremains. She had in fact utilized other bones to reach a similar conclusion. Now we know that Dr. Bennett was the first forensic anthropologist to examine the human cremains because his name is mentioned in the criminal complaint that was filed on November the 15th, 2005. And we can see that it was Dr. Bennett who had examined the cremains first, and then Dr. Eisenberg examined the cremains secondly. Interestingly, Dr. Bennett was not called up to testify at any of the trials. Now, Dr. Eisenberg wrote an extensive forensic anthropology case report, and it was dated December the 4th, 2006, remembering that the Stephen Avery trial took place on February the 12th, 2007, which of course meant that both the defense and the state had access to this document in regards to the human cremains. Now, in this report, Dr. Eisenberg stated the range of activities that she was requested to do. And I'll just read two of them. One of those activities was the recognition and separation of burnt, human from burned and unburned non-human bones. So basically to separate human bones from non-human bones, like for example from an animal. And the other one is the identification and inventory of diagnostic burned human bone elements, which means that by looking at these particular diagnostic burned bones, you can determine what part of the skeleton that those particular bone fragments come from, whether they're from an adult, whether they're from a male or a female, and also where in the skeleton that these fragments come from. Now, remembering that Dr. Eisenberg had examined the cremains on had initially examined the cremains on November the 10th, 2005. However, it became apparent by reading Dr. Eisenberg's forensic anthropology case report that in actual fact, it became much more complex. And what Kathleen Zellner noted by looking at the report, and I quote, more human bones with cut marks on them, they were discovered. And I'm going to, for the purposes of this presentation, discuss evidence tags 8675 and 7412 for the purposes that both of these evidence tags contain potential human burnt pelvic fragments. Now, there were debris piles found at the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit, and you can see here that evidence tag 8675 was found on the 11th of the 11th 05, whereas evidence tag 7412 was found later on the 4/10/06. And you can see from these reports that quite a few debris piles were found at the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. So the story actually became much more complex. So the bone piles were placed in tables and documented, and it became apparent, if you look at them, that evidence tag 7412 and 8675 both were found at quarry pile number 1. And if you have a look, in actual fact, there are 3 quarry pile bones, 3 of them in total. Now, we have the GPS coordinates for both 7412 and evidence tag 8675, and both are co-located at exactly the same location. Now, what is interesting here is that in Dr. Eisenberg's report, she obviously had examined these cremains, and these are the notes that she wrote about these cremains at the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. I quote, "Calcined human bone fragments." And basically, if a bone fragment is calcined, it means that it has been exposed to very, very high temperatures. And what happens is the organic matter inside the bone dries up, it's burnt away, and the bone has a distinctive white appearance. In fact, it almost resembles porcelain. I continue. Most bone fragments are all cut bone fragments are human. And in this case, she's referring to evidence tag 7412, which was from quarry pile number 1. Burned, calcined human bone fragments with cut edges. Cut, burned human bone. And this one in particular is very interesting. Possible human burn cut pelvis fragments in evidence tag 8675, which was also found in quarry pile 1. Unfortunately, we have the same situation. There are no in situ photographs from the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. I wonder why that is the case. Alright, now let's have a look precisely where those pelvic bone fragments were found at the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. And this is a recent photograph from Google Earth. And as you can see, quarry pile 1 that contains both evidence tag 7412 and 8675 are located in the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. They're just in the border for the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. But what strikes one immediately is that these bone fragments, pelvic bone fragments, were not on the Avery salvage yard. They're nowhere near it. Now, Dr. Eisenberg, in her report, had examined the bone fragments from evidence tag 8675, and I quote, "A sharp horizontal through and through cut to the superior aspect of an iliac blade," so that's one bone, then she describes another one, "and sharp vertical cuts located on either side of a right sacroiliac articulation." The right sacroiliac area includes a portion of the right side of the sacrum and the still articulated auricular surface of the ilium. These fragmentary cup bones are suspected to be of possible human origin because of their observable anatomic contours as well as the expected ratio of cortical to trabecular bone. All that simply means is that Dr. Eisenberg was able to examine these particular pelvic bone fragments, and due to the contours, due to the shape, due to the composition of specific bone components, they were consistent with being human, not animal. Alright, now Dr. Eisenberg was questioned by Attorney Strang during the Stephen Avery trial. And I quote, "Okay, alright, so the question then, is the thickness of the bone wall here that you observed on these two pelvic bone fragments, was that thickness at least consistent with human pelvic bone?" Answer: let me answer your question in two parts. The first part is that the architecture or the makeup of these pelvic bone cut fragments is different in character and shape than the long bones you have been talking about. The internal structure of these bones, and she's referring to the human pelvic bones, is made up of almost entirely of honeycomb looking bone. Alright, I continue. And so using the long bone as an example may not be an accurate comparison. Secondly, the thinness of the outside bone of these pelvic cut fragments is not inconsistent with the thickness I would expect to see relative to the honeycomb bone in humans. Okay, is it not inconsistent with the human correct bone? And let me ask you just maybe the simplest, most straightforward question here. Is what made you suspect that these pieces of pelvic bone could be human? Answer: the contours of the bone, and more particularly the shape of what we call the articular surfaces, where one bone fits with another bone at the hip joint. Question: those appeared consistent with a human being? Answer, and note, with the shape and the contours of what would be expected in a human bone. Now the upshot of all this, without her actually coming out and saying it, was that there was nothing to suggest anything but human pelvic cut bone fragments at the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. And of course, this potentially was a huge issue for the state, because we already know that there was a pelvic bone fragment found in the Stephen Avery burn pit. Alright, so let's have a look at these particular bones. Let's have a look at the Illiac blade or crest found in evidence tag 8675. So here's a photograph of that particular bone, and Dr. Eisenberg had described it as an upper aspect of an iliac blade, which is the upper portion of the hip bone. This was found in evidence tag 8675. In the trial, she stated, it's impossible to side the iliac crest, which means we don't know whether that particular bone fragment comes from the left side of your hip or the right side of your hip. And that's fair enough. So if we have a look at a human female hip with all the pelvic bones, you can see the location of the iliac crest. It's got a diagnostic shape and morphology. So someone who knows the structure of bones would definitely be able to determine that it is an iliac crest, or from the iliac crest. We mustn't forget that Dr. Ken Bennett found an ilium bone fragment from the Stephen Avery's burn pit, and shown here is the location of the ilium. And he was able to determine, just by looking at that fragment, which would have only been a few inches in size, he determined that that particular bone fragment had come from an adult human female. Alright, let's have a look at an extremely important bone or set of bones, the right sacroiliac joint, found in evidence tag 8675. So here's a photograph of that bone, and Dr. Eisenberg stated that the bone was a right sacroiliac joint in anatomical position. That simply means how it would be arranged in a skeleton, in a human skeleton, with a vertical cut to either side marked by stars. It basically means that someone had sliced straight through both sides of the sacroiliac joint on the right hand side. And we can have a look at a picture of a human female pelvis, and you can see the location of this particular set of bones. There are two of them, they're joined together. Someone had sliced on either side of the sacroiliac joint, and we can actually see the fine line between the two bones. This is the surface where both bones are joined together. So someone had basically sliced away the iliac crest from the sacrum. Alright, however, there were other evidence tags that were found at the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. For example, evidence tag 7412. Now, Kathleen Zellner employed the services of Dr. Stephen Symes, who was, or still is, a forensic anthropologist. Now, he viewed photographs, and he stated in his supplemental affidavit that tag 7412 likely has cut bones that show thin cortical bone and uniform rounded trabeculae consistent with the human pelvis. Notice Dr. Symes didn't say suspected human pelvis. He stated they are from a human pelvis. And you can see here in the red arrow, there is a slice mark straight through that bone fragment. It's like you've got a fresh loaf of bread and you cut it open and you can see the inside of the loaf. In this particular case, you can see that on the outside of the bone there is a thin cortical layer, and you can see the internal structure of the bone, which is the rounded trabeculae. And this particular type of setup or arrangement is characteristic of human bones. And we can see here a photograph of Dr. Stephen Symes with Kathleen Zellner. And you can see that he's got an assortment of blades and knives. And what he did was he used the blades and knives to cut a bone, to have a look at the type of cut marks that one would expect from these instruments on bone. And what is interesting here is that in front of Dr. Symes is a deer field dressing kit. And essentially this type of kit is used to dismember a deer. Alright, so let's summarize. We're nearly coming to the end of part 1. Let's summarize what we've got so far. So shown here is Stephen Avery's trailer, and behind Stephen Avery's shed was the Stephen Avery's burn pit, and bones allegedly were found in the burn pit and given evidence tag 8318. Dr. Bennett observed the bones and he found an ilium bone, and he stated that that ilium bone was from an adult human female. Now, note that additional human cremains were also found in Stephen Avery's burn pit. At the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit, we can see the geolocation of quarry pile number 1 that contain evidence tag 8675 and 7412. Dr. Eisenberg had examined those bones, and she stated that they resembled pelvic bone fragments with cut marks. However, she stated that they were suspect human. Also, additional human cremains were found at the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit. And the important thing to realize is that they were fragmented and burnt as well. And really, to complete the summary of where the cremains were found, we also have human cremains found in Janda Burn Barrel number 2. That was given evidence tag 7964, and human cremains were discovered in the Janda Burn Barrel number 2, such as the shoulder blade, the spinal column fragments, metacarpals, which are found in your hand, and also the presence of long bones. But because the long bones were fragmented, it was very difficult to determine whether they had come from an arm or a leg. All right. Now, Attorney Strang asked a very important question in regards to the human cremains at the 3 sites. And he questioned Dr. Eisenberg, and he asked, question, but the burnt bone fragments that you saw from the 3 sites, again, all were roughly similar in their burning, charring, and calcining. Answer, that is correct. So therefore, the cremains that were found in the Stephen Avery burn pit, the Janda Burn Barrel number 2, and the Manitowoc County Gravel Pit were all burnt in a similar manner. And that's a very important point. So I like to conclude the end of part 1 here, and hopefully you will join me in part 2, where we look at how both the state and the defense had handled the fact that there were multiple human cremains found in at least 3 separate geolocations. Many thanks for joining in with me.